bear with me. This message has several big chunks to it, and they have been rearranging themselves for 2 weeks now. I think the best place to start is to draw our attention to what happened at the beginning of our unprogrammed period. That simple act of kindness reminds me of one time when I was taking, what did I take with Pete Moore? Those of you who went to Guilford College, you remember Pete Moore? In the religion department? I took Quakerism from him. And one day for the lectures, he had his daughter come to speak with us, and she told us about whatever it was she was working on at the time. I don't even remember, because it's been almost 40 years now. And the thing that sticks in my mind is that she had her small daughter with her. Rather like Allison and Ava Grace, if you remember them. And while Pete's daughter was explaining what she was doing in the wonderful modern world of Quakers, the granddaughter was busying herself playing with some of the toys that her mother had brought in order to keep the child occupied. And at the end of class, everybody filed out except Pete, his daughter, his granddaughter, and me. I stayed behind to help gather up the toys because somebody needed to do it. And later on that day or the day after, a fellow I knew in those days who was not the most effervescent of personalities, but he took a minute and brought up what I had done to help gather up, and said that impressed him. Well, I hadn't set out to impress anybody. It was just something that needed to be done, and I expect you hadn't either. And that seems to be as good a place as any to pick up the text for this morning, which is a possibly familiar text that is now in the Gospel of John, but wasn't in the Gospel of John for probably 1,000 years after it was written, or close to 1,000 years. John 7:53 to 8:11. They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. And early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Rabbi, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such as these. What do you say about her?" This they said to him that they might have something to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the eldest, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus looked up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and do not sin again." One of our favorite Quaker stories, which is full of truth, whether it actually happened or not, is that in the early days of the movement, William Penn, whose father was an admiral for the British government, would deck out in his Restoration Cavalier finery, including decorative sword. Mm-hmm. He would go and attend meeting, all dolled up like this. And of course, he outshone everybody else who was at meeting. And one day, the story goes, he met George Fox coming out. And Fox, Fox was cordial to him. And Penn, who was no dummy, said that, well, he knew that, nobody else, dressed quite the way he did. Well, I mean, he was used to social stratification. But he especially noticed that nobody else had a sword. And he pointed out to Fox that, well, it wasn't just a decorative accessory for the well-dressed gentleman. It had, on occasion, gotten him out of some tight scrapes. And George Fox listens, and when Penn is finished, he says to him, "Wear it as long as thou canst." And the two part and go their ways. Sometime later, they are emerging from the same meeting house at the same time again, and happen to start conversing. And this time Fox notices that Penn isn't wearing his sword, and he brings it up to William Penn, and Penn says, "Oh, that. Well, I took thy advice. I wore it as long as I could." The idea is, leave them to God. God is a much more efficient stirrer of conscience than any of us will ever be. God has been in the business a lot longer than any of us has ever been or ever will be. And that if you are walking the right path, as the path unfolds, various things will be opened to you. And this sort of goes along with, Jesus's approach. He is brought a woman, not both parties as should have happened, but just a woman who has been who has been caught in, shall we say, a compromising situation. And they, the people who hustled the woman in front of him wanted to know what he would say, of course, because if he said that she should be stoned, well, that went against his teaching of a love ethic, and also could possibly have been used to charge him before the Roman authorities. But if he wouldn't uphold what it said in the law, then that would discredit him with the Jews. And true to form, Jesus did what is sort of a standard rabbinical technique, apparently. He didn't rule on the validity of the passages of Scripture that that the accusers brought the woman to him under. What he did was hedge it about with a restriction that was so binding that they couldn't actually fulfill it. He who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone. Well, Lord knows I couldn't throw that rock. I doubt any of the rest of us could either. And so when everybody else had gone, Jesus treated the woman with compassion and with kindness. Tomorrow will be 2 weeks since that draft decision of the Supreme Court was leaked. And I'm sure you know which one I mean. My own journey on the topic of abortion has been a bit bumpy at times. I mean, when Jimmy Carter was being nominated to run for president, well, cousin Jimmy, I didn't know he was kin back then. I was against him because, he was pro-choice. And indeed, my natural sympathy would be with the so-called consistency of life ethic, or as was coined several decades back about them, the seamless garment movement, and that's a reference, of course, to the seamless garment that Jesus was wearing when they took him out to the cross, and that the soldiers sat around the foot of the cross, rolling their knuckle bones and gambling over. And that holds that war, murder, capital punishment, and abortion, are all of the same piece. And that a human being taking another human being's life is wrong. And I mean, that's where my natural sympathies would be. I actually have a few relatives, some of them very close, who, if the circumstances had worked out just right, would never have been born. I also once met, Joyce took me to meet a relative of hers. She was never quite clear whether the woman was also a relative of mine, whose mother had found herself, as we used to say, in trouble. And whether she panicked or what, had actually tried to end the pregnancy before the child was born, but the baby wouldn't shift. And yes, this woman, whose name I believe was Annie, did have lasting repercussions from that. But God or the universe or whatever or whoever meant her to be born, and so she was born. And in fact, when I moved into one of the spare bedrooms in Joyce's house some years ago, she gave me the room that her brother had slept in, and the chest of drawers in that room had come from this woman, Annie, whom Joyce thought a great deal of. I mean, those would be my natural sympathies. But when you actually get to know people, when you hear their stories, when you stop to listen to them instead of doing what we all are guilty of, which is listening just enough to figure out what we're going to say next, you learn that no matter how neat and logical a package you can make, we are looking for a perfect fit in an off-the-rack world, to quote from an old MASH episode. It doesn't always happen that way. And one day at work, Ollie, you would have loved this job I had. I worked at a place called We Buy Treasure, and I was doing genealogy. I heard that. I was doing genealogy. We had, what we were basically in was in the souvenir business. And so it was my job to help look up the heirs of famous sports stars or celebrities. Of course, you had to stay away from what they call the A-list. And sometimes you had to get a ruling on whether this person or that could really be considered A-list or not. And then you would search for the closest living relatives to see if they had any memorabilia that they wanted to sell. And one day at the end of the work shift, the owner, who was a Catholic, one of the conservative ones, if you know about Opus Dei, you know the sort I mean, calls me up front, and he asks me about what I think about abortion. Now, I could have said that this was wildly inappropriate, which it was, and that it was none of his business, which it wasn't. But I listened as he described his own feelings on the subject, and what I recognized was that he was giving me a variation of a good old-fashioned Quaker concern. And having that slot to file it in, I did. And I told him what I thought, which was, in the end, that any time that the situation comes up, there is cruelty involved, and it's cruelty all around, and that I just didn't feel competent to judge between competing cruelties. And that being so, I had no choice but to say, leave things like that between the woman, ideally her husband, her conscience, and her God. Contrary to what people on both sides of our polarized society would tell us, it really is possible for people of goodwill who are struggling with something big to have differing opinions. And it doesn't mean that either of you is out of touch with or out of step with, whatever God wants or however you want to put it. It means that you see different facets of the same thing. If I were going to critique the pro-life movement, especially the Christian arm of it, I would say first that they should slow down because they are basically driving the church off a cliff over it. And then I would share this quote from Dave Barnhart, who was a Methodist pastor in Birmingham, Alabama. And what he wrote back 3 or 4 years ago was, "The unborn are a convenient group of people to advocate for. They never make demands of you. They are morally uncomplicated, unlike the incarcerated, addicted, or the chronically poor. They don't resent your condescension or complain that you're not politically correct. Unlike widows, they don't ask you to question patriarchy. Unlike orphans, they don't need money or education or child care. Unlike aliens, they don't bring all that racial, cultural, and religious baggage that you dislike. They allow you to feel good about yourself without any work at creating or maintaining relationships. And when they're born, you can forget about them because they cease to be unborn. You can love the unborn and advocate for them without substantially challenging your own wealth, power, or privilege. Without reimagining social structures, apologizing, or making reparations to anyone. They are, in short, the perfect people to love if you want to claim you love Jesus, but actually dislike people who breathe. Prisoners, immigrants, the sick, the poor, widows, orphans, all the groups that are specifically mentioned in the Bible, they all get thrown under the bus for the unborn. And there is an uncomfortable amount of truth in that. But it's not, it's not just that side, that I would critique, but let's live with his criticism for a moment before we move on. How many of you have heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Oh, I'm impressed from you. Oh, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor in Nazi Germany who was rounded up and sent to the camps eventually. And eventually, You know what happened to people, to a lot of people who got into the concentration camps. One of the books that he wrote was called The Cost of Discipleship. And he complains in that about what he called cheap grace. You know, you give absolution, but you ask nothing of the person who is actually before you. I mean, it's sort of like the complaint that the early Quakers had about people wanting to be saved in their sins rather than from them. You know, if the spiritual life means anything, it can't be something that you trot out one day a week or on special days in the year or whatever. It has to inform who you are all the time. And the ongoing wisdom of Quakerism has, in many cases, added it should be kind. I mean, one of the verses that has been added to simple gifts talks about, "'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be kind. 'Tis a gift to know one another's mind," or something. And, you know, being willing to advocate for this amorphous group, but not do anything for them once they actually show up, is not kind. Now for the other side. The trouble with abortion is that in many instances, it's rather like divorce. There's a failure involved. I mean, and it's never and it's not always the same failure that is involved. Sometimes the failure is just with the simple biology. The egg doesn't implant where it should, and the mother will die. The child will never be born, and the mother will die if nothing is done. Sometimes, whose fault is that? Sometimes the failure is just that, well, in the case that Joyce mentioned to me, the couple whose first baby had Tay-Sachs, the second pregnant, and died a horrible death. The second pregnancy they ended because the second embryo the second fetus had Tay-Sachs as well. And what it turned out was that the woman knew that she had Jewish heritage, but her husband didn't realize that he did. I mean, in that case, they became foster parents, and they were presented with the opportunity to to foster this entire family of children who had lost both parents at the same time, and they leaped at it and ended up adopting them. There was a failure there. There were a couple of them, but they were able to find a way to turn it around. Sometimes a young lady has not made wise decisions. They've made bad choices and are not members of families that will help them through that. I mean, that's a failure. Sometimes Sometimes girls are betrayed by people they should be able to trust. And the parents can't protect her because, the parents can't protect their daughter because the same person betrayed them, or worse. The pro-choice crowd would have more moral authority if every now and again, they would talk about being willing. You'd put yourself on the line to help somebody deal with the fallout from these failures. I mean, not all failures leave you with anybody to blame. I mean, it's a very difficult situation, but what we have right now is people who usually are of goodwill, but somehow are not going to be kind to each other. They are not going to listen to try to understand. It's just, oh, you ticked that box, well, forget you. When you start writing off people that way, that is not the gospel. No matter, William Penn said, whoever is right, he who persecutes is wrong, if I remember correctly. As a child, I was rather on the tender-hearted side. And my favorite song, how many of you remember Glenn Campbell? Yeah. My favorite song when I was still in single digits, so I was younger than Sage is, was Try a Little Kindness. I wasn't 10 years old. I didn't know what narrow-minded meant. I knew that it sounded like it was a bad thing. But I did have some idea of what kindness meant. And I knew that was generally being thought of by the grown-ups around me as being a good thing. I know you remember the chorus going, "You've got to try a little kindness, just show a little kindness, just shine your light for everyone to see. And if you try a little kindness, then you'll overlook the blindness of the narrow-minded people on the narrow-minded streets." Women loved Jesus because he was kind to them. If we are going to follow in his footsteps, can we be any less?